What's going on, everybody, and welcome to episode, what is it at this point? Episode 113, I believe, of the Book Binge, where this week we are reviewing the Dragon Reborn, the third book in the Wheel of Time. Now, if you've been following along with my Wheel of Time diaries, which are essentially just like spoiler talks, although they have a little bit of spoiler-free discussion otherwise, you kind of know my general thoughts on this book. There was a lot of crazy stuff that happened. There were some things that I had predicted about it that I got right. There were some things that I'd predicted that I got right, but for the wrong reasons, and there were some things that I was just totally wrong about, as is going to be the case with any series, not just Wheel of Time, and not just this book within the Wheel of Time. This series so far has been a trip, and I've been very happy with it up to this point. I've read, like I said, these first three books, this sort of first arc, this first trilogy, so to speak, of the series, and I want to talk about how this entry continued my trend of enjoyment. Let's talk about the good quite briefly here. I think this video, similar to the Great Hunt review, is going to be fairly short. You know, the further you get into a series, the harder it is to talk about it spoiler-free, but this video does sort of assume that you have read at least through the Great Hunt. This video does go into very minor spoilers, sort of, for the first two books, but they're not like spoilers of anything that happens. They're sort of more conceptual things about like POV allocation, stuff like that, and I will briefly go into very minor spoilers about some of those aspects into this book as well, but I'm not going to do anything that like really spoils the book for you, so be warned. I will make note, it will be the section titled The Ugly, where I get into these sort of minor spoilery things, so everything from before that won't be anything that will, you know, ruin anything for you. There's not going to be any spoilers in the sections prior to that, but that section you are free to skip if you are worried about it. I will remind you later when we get to that point in the video. In regards to the book, I mean, I guess that is kind of a decent transition. In regards to the book, the good of the Dragon Reborn is simply just the fact that, like, I thought that the material that was included in here, and I say that very specifically for reasons we'll discuss later, I thought what was in here was pretty much perfect. I really enjoyed basically everything that Robert Jordan was covering in the Dragon Reborn. The POVs that he selected and the way that he utilized them in this book, I thought were fantastic, like just really good. This is something that has been a trend so far up to this point in the series. Everything has just been really great quality writing. I've been surprisingly pleasantly surprised by Jordan's prose. I know that his prose doesn't necessarily get the greatest recommendation from some people, especially when you get into some of the later books when he's a little bit more wordy in ways that aren't necessarily quite so good, and that's when his prose kind of takes a deep dive downwards in the absolute wrong direction, where there are some chapters where it's just like, wow, that was really well written, and some of those stuff that just is pointless and wordy and, you know, get to the dang point already. I'm aware that that kind of stuff appears a little bit more later in the series, or at least later in Jordan's part of the series. I don't necessarily know how, generally speaking, people broadly feel about Brandon Sanderson's prose contributions to the series versus Jordan's, and who's better, who's more consistent, whatever. This isn't the topic of today's video, so I don't know why I'm talking about it. Either way, I've been pleasantly surprised by Jordan's writing in the books themselves, and I found that his writing was very good in this book as well, continuing the trend of the first two books, with one exception, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Just in the next section, there was a little bit of a mystery in the Dragon Reborn to a couple different things in the setting of Tarvalon, which I thought was pretty neat. I enjoyed what was going on there with the characters there and the sort of storyline that was being followed, and the way that that kind of melded into the climax. And this is a general theme of the book. The way that all the storylines were threaded together and brought into the climax, I thought was very well done, in spite of one decision that is almost baffling. It is almost baffling. But all this is stuff that we can discuss a little bit later as well. The way that, like I said, the threads are guided towards the climax, it isn't just, you know, the sort of mystery that happens at Tarvalon that I thought was great. It was also, you know, sort of the other storyline following another character that I thought was really good, and the way that that led over, and then another character sort of coming into his own and getting his first POV in this book that I was really excited to get to. He's a fan favorite character that I was really excited to get to, and I'm grateful to say that I really liked his POVs in this book as well, but just the way that all three of these major storylines, these major POVs were kind of, brought towards the end in a single location, that I thought was just really great. In terms of the bad, I will say my biggest complaint about the book, but all things considered, it's not really that big of a complaint, but the biggest thing that I will say is a little bit strange about this book is the POV allocation, and there's a little bit of this that is a theme of the video so far. We can talk about ever so slightly a little bit later, but there is a little bit of strange POV. The first POV of the book, not counting the prologue, which I suppose I should have included the prologue in the good. This was the best prologue of the 3 books. Incredible. Very good prologue. I loved it. But following the prologue, there is a POV, and that POV takes about 90 pages of the book, just like right at the start. I thought that was great. I really liked the POV. I liked what was happening. It all worked for me. But then that POV doesn't come back again for another 220 pages. The next 220 pages are spent nearly almost entirely on one other character. There are 2 other characters that I believe have 1 chapter of POV in this 220 page section, and then another character who gets his first POVs in the series so far in this section, but he only gets a few chapters in there as well. But most of these 220 pages, at least 150 pages of it, is spent with 1 other POV, and the fact that this storyline takes so much time and doesn't return to the first one that took the first 90 pages was a little bit strange to me. I wasn't sure why that happened. It of course made sense when we came back to the other POV. It was like, you know what, timing wise, this actually makes sense. I'm not going to complain about that too much. But it did seem a little bit weird while reading it, and this is kind of a broad theme of the book. While reading it, you might think that some of the POV allocation is weird, and especially for one other example that I already hinted at before, which we'll talk about in the next section, which includes minor spoilers. The only other thing that I will say explicitly I did not like about the book: Nynaeve, stop tugging your braid 5 times every 3 pages. Like, please stop. Like, there's no point. Like, stop, please. You don't need to tug it after literally every little thing. That was the one thing about Jordan's writing in this book that really started to irk me. Apparently that specific aspect calms down a little bit in the coming books as Jordan finds some other writing quirks that other people find really annoying. But yeah, that was the one thing about the writing that was just like, okay, now I'm actually like really noticing this. In The Great Hunt, there were a couple, just a couple mentions of things where you could see like the start of where Jordan's weird writing quirks were going to start coming out. But if not for people's complaining about those things, I never would have noticed them in The Great Hunt otherwise, but I did because of people's complaints. In this book, it was like, okay, even without people's complaints, this is excessive. Please stop tugging your braid, Nynaeve. But beyond that, it's pretty minor stuff, all things considered. In terms of the ugly, again, this is where we'll go into minor spoilers about POV allocation specifically. So it's nothing too crazy in terms of what I'm talking about from the first 2 books, but it is kind of a spoiler for this book in terms of one POV. So if you don't want to hear about that, you can skip the section. That's fine. You can just go down into the description, find the timestamp for the recommendation. You can skip there. But in terms of the ugly, I will say that the name of this book is almost baffling because of POV allocation. Now, in Eye of the World, I would say probably 85% of that book is Rand's POV. Somewhere between 80 and 85% of that book is just Rand. And then The Great Hunt, I would say, is probably 65% Rand, maybe even a little bit more than that as well. So there's a little bit more going on with other POVs in The Great Hunt compared to the first book. But of the first 2 books, easily 70% of the first 2 books is just Rand's POV. So a lot of it is spent on this one character. And this is direct spoilers, actually, for The Great Hunt and Eye of the World, and I guess this book. Like, it is direct spoilers. So if you don't want that, skip to the next section. The Dragon Reborn is revealed to be Rand pretty early in the series, like surprisingly early in the series, and it's all but confirmed in book 2. Like, we're pretty dang certain that is the case. There's only one last thing that needs to happen for him to be confirmed. Like, everybody in the entire world knows that he's the Dragon Reborn now. There's only one other thing that needs to happen, which is, sort of what this book follows to a degree. But the fact that the book is called The Dragon Reborn, and the fact that Rand has been the primary POV of the first 2 books, and then he literally has like one, maybe 1.5 chapters worth of POV in this book, is a strange decision. The title still makes sense because a lot of what happens in the climax, and that's all I'll say on that front. But the fact that this one major POV is still missing, nearly missing from the book, is a strange decision. I predicted that Rand wouldn't be a very, prominent POV in the book, but I predicted it for the wrong reasons. I suspected that it was going to be because other characters were going to be, showing Rand, from a different POV, like explaining Rand from a different POV. And that was sort of right at first, but then it quickly became like, oh, Rand is just very tangentially related to the story and is simply the linchpin of what happens with the other storylines. That's a spoiler area, so I'll go there. So yeah, the ugly is simply that the fact that the book's name is The Dragon Reborn, and the character who we learn in the books prior is the Dragon Reborn, is not the main character of the book, is a little bit of a strange decision. Until you get to the climax, that is for sure. In terms of the recommendation, I would say absolutely read this. I know, like, I kind of said this in the last video, and a lot of people often say this. If you don't jive with the series after The Great Hunt, if you read The Great Hunt and you didn't really like it, the series probably isn't for you. For me, I'm going to go ahead and say at least read through here, because these first 3 books do make up a pretty complete arc, a completed enough arc that with relatively minor reworking could just be a standalone trilogy, like it could just be its own thing without the other 12 books, tacked on to the end of it, or rather the other 11 books in the prequel. But my point is these 3 books make up a good enough arc that even if you're unsure after The Great Hunt, that I still recommend reading this book just so that you can complete that arc. And if you're not into the series at all at this point, it might be worth just, not continuing. But, I think it's good to at least get through this arc, because I really enjoyed this book. Like, I really did. I know some other people don't necessarily love it too much, primarily for the purposes that I just outlined in the ugly. But I really enjoyed what was in here. Like, I really enjoyed it. I guess some people will say that you can try reading through the Shadow Rising, and if you don't really like the Shadow Rising, then the series is definitely not for you. But I think getting through this first arc should be enough to determine whether, like, it's worth you giving a full shot or not. But with that being said, I'm excited to start the Shadow Rising, here in just like a week, maybe even a little bit less than a week. I think I'm recording this video like 1 week from the end, or not even recording, I'm releasing this video like 1 week from the end of the month. So at the time you're seeing this, probably within the week, I'll be starting the Shadow Rising. That will be encompassing all of November and December on, the Wheel of Time Diary. So if you want to see, upwards of 9 videos about the Shadow Rising, because I'm going to take my time on that one versus this one, where I just covered way too much material in way too little time because I read it way too fast, considered watching the Wheel of Time Diaries. And if you go back and watch all of the ones that I did for the previous books in the series, there were 5 on Eye of the World, 4 on The Great Hunt, and 3 on The Dragon Reborn. You can go ahead and watch those and then be caught up by the time I actually start reading the Shadow Rising. So thank you guys for watching this review. If you did, I greatly appreciate it. I will be back on Thursday for a special sort of review about my spooky season reading for the month of October. I hope you go ahead and check that out. Otherwise, I'll be back, in the next video.